Hard to believe, 48 years ago today, June 23rd, 1972, Title IX was signed into law officially. You were a high school senior living in Louisville, Kentucky, if I'm not mistaken. What do you remember about that day? Was it a big deal?
I wish I could tell you people were doing cartwheels and somersaults, and it honestly, as a high school senior, didn't know the first thing about Title IX, didn't even know the law passed.
Oh, when you got to college, did you sense that a law was passed, even in conversations with fellow student athletes?
Well, Yogi, what was fortunate for me was I needed a job because I was a student athlete, not on scholarship. And so I was hired in the intramural and recreation department by the woman who coached volleyball, softball, field hockey, basketball. So Title IX was passed, and her student worker was Ceal Barry. So I used to work 20 hours a week. I worked every day, went over to the rec center and worked, and all the women's sports were in the rec building. They were recreation, they were intramural, not intramural, but club sports. So Title IX was implemented at the University of Kentucky, and I was like the courier from the women's athletic director over to the president's office, taking things back and forth. Eventually, it kind of grew into helping her order uniforms, hire coaches. So the law was implemented during my 4 years as a student worker at the University of Kentucky. And pretty soon I was a beneficiary. By the time I was a junior and a senior, Kentucky men's basketball was big time. We practiced in the same, Memorial Coliseum. Joe B. Hall was the head coach, Rick Roby, Mike Phillips. And here we were, little club sport women who now were in kind of the big leagues. So it was, you didn't really recognize that it was historical. But now when I look back on it, I was like, wow, that was pretty historical.
Ceal, and to that point, I've read that as a senior at Kentucky, you were the first women's basketball player in Kentucky history to be on scholarship, and that the budget for women's sports went from $3,000 to $100,000 during your 4 years there. So I guess, you talk about that as you look back, there started to be a shift that you can see now, but when do you think the culture surrounding women's sports truly started to change and evolve?
Honestly, it didn't start changing and evolving till the 80s. There was a lot of backlash, Ashley. You can't imagine. And my boss at the time, who was my coach back in the 80s or in the 70s at the time, was kind of in the same boat as most women. You have to remember, they were not members of the athletics department. They were members of the intramurals and recreation or the phys ed department that the athletics department all of a sudden had to assume. And they had to assume their salary, and they had to assume a few sports. So it's not by chance that the budget went from $3,000 to $100,000 at Kentucky or any other big school like that. The culture, it was not fun. And I watched a lot of women go through some very difficult times. So people like myself could really benefit from it. I mean, by the 80s, I got my first job as a head coach at 24, not because I was all that great. It was because I was the only one available. There were no head coach. I didn't compete with anybody to get my job at Cincinnati. I competed with probably 3 people. But I mean, you did have to win games. But I look now back at the women in the 70s and the early 80s. This was pre-NCAA, where there was a lot of backlash. And they're the real heroines of Title IX and the pioneers that really didn't back down and really had their reputations kind of tarnished because they fought for equal rights, essentially.
Well, first off, Cincinnati was really lucky because they got a Hall of Famer in their early 20s. So let's make sure we announce that if you didn't know it already. But I want to ask a follow-up to that. Like right now, we're at a beautiful time with athletes using their voices, right? We've had Katie Nixon on this podcast. You hear athletes from around the country using their voices, talk about racism. Curious, back then, did you and maybe some of your teammates, like, did you feel as though you wanted to use your voice, and maybe voice is in air quotes and it was how you played, but something to demonstrate like, hey, look, like this is a good thing. And we're not just athletes, but we can play and we can compete and win, and you need to respect us.
You know, Yogi, that's such a great question. It's a great question. And the honest answer is no, because we were so afraid that at any moment the rug would be pulled out from underneath us, the funding would be taken away if we didn't behave, if we didn't really align ourselves and try to be good soldiers, that it might all go away. I mean, honestly, I played at a time, my freshman and sophomore year, if you can imagine, Division I athlete, there were 4 to a room the night before a game. I had to show up. Well, actually, as a student worker, I went and got the station wagon, brought it back. We got 3 station wagons, brought it back. Each player brought their $20. You paid for your own meals, and $20 could get you a lot of McDonald's back then. So we knew what it was like to be one of the have-nots. So the thought of demonstrating or, protesting to the athletic director, we were just being introduced to the athletics department. So historically, you'll see that women athletes make good grades, don't have a whole lot of conduct issues. That started way back in the early years. We got the message early: be on your best behavior, go to class, don't cause trouble, that sort of thing, because there are good things ahead of you if you follow the company line, sort of thing.
Ceal, it's fascinating. You mentioned that you became the head coach at Cincinnati when you were 24 years old, youngest D1 coach at that time. You were hired at Colorado a few years later. What do you remember about first arriving in Boulder? Because it was obviously probably pretty different from where you grew up, and just now all of a sudden you were taking over a program. What was that like for you?
Well, I do want to, this kind of connects with the last question. I do remember driving into Boulder, and one of the administrators that was in the car with me turned to me, and we're coming over that beautiful overlook that goes down into the valley, and he turns to me, and I was young, I was probably 27, and he turns to me and looked at me and he goes, "You're not one of those women's livers, are you?" That's one of the first, and now we laugh because we look back and people change because your job is go in there and do a great job. But the message to me was don't pound your fist on the table to get equal opportunities for your kids, just go win games. And so when you think about culture and what it was like, there was definitely messages, and that happened on more than one occasion early in my career, in terms of culture, in terms of be grateful for what we're giving you and don't ask for any more. And I'm not trying to be negative Nelly here, but I do think it's important for people today, because we're nowhere near in that sort of culture right now in 2020. But point being, we don't want to go backwards either.
Was there a time in your coaching career at Colorado where you felt it turn? You felt no one was going to look at you and say, "Hey, are you one of those women's libs?"
Yes. In 1989, our arena was 10 years old, and we hosted the very first NCAA championship in the building, in the old Coors Event Center. It was called the Events and Conference Center. It sold out. 11,199. They had to call the fire marshals, actually prevented people. They shut the doors in 1989. So I'd been there 6 years, and we had a sellout for a women's game. After that, no one ever called me a women's liver, ever. But my AD at the time, Bill Marolt, told me, I said, "Yeah, now people are going to expect that." And he goes, "You're right, Ceal. Now people are going to expect that." Kind of like, this is the big time. This is what happens when you success begets more success. So get used to it. If you want to compete in the arena, this is what it's like. And it was like that, and I totally enjoyed it.